Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show, Me, Myself, and TBI. I'm your host, Christina Brown Fisher. My guest is author Tina Hutchence. Her book, Michael, My Brother, Lost Boy of INXS, tells the touching story of her brother's rise from curious and rambunctious young kid to enchanting and popular lead singer of the Australian rock band INXS. In 1997, Michael Hutchence was found dead in his hotel room in Sydney, suicide by hanging. Just 5 years before taking his own life, in 1992, Hutchence suffered a traumatic brain injury. A taxi driver attacked him, fracturing his skull. Tina says her brother was never the same. Thank you for joining me today, Tina.
Oh, you're welcome, Christina.
It's a real pleasure to have you. Tina, you are the oldest of three, yourself and your two younger brothers, Rhett and Michael. And in your book, you talk about how particularly Michael, at a very early age, displayed his interest in music and in performing. One account I found really funny and cute was about his first recording, a song for a Christmas holiday toy. Tell me about that.
That was so interesting. And how that came about was he was about 12 years old. And my mother was at a cocktail party. My parents were very social in Hong Kong. And she was talking to this man who had a large advertising company. And he said to her, do you have any children? She said, yes, I have two young boys and a girl. She would always say a girl a little older when I was 12 years older than Michael. But he said, they don't sing. Do either of them sing? And she said, well, Michael could probably carry a tune. He said, I need him in the studio tomorrow. And I just want him to sing some Christmas songs. And they didn't know what it was for. They knew, she took him in and he did very well. He was kind of quiet at first, but she started singing with him to move him along because he was in a recording booth with the headphones on and everything, something he'd never even seen before. But he sang 3 or 4 different Christmas songs, and they said, it's on this, going to be on this recording. And the day came, and they said, okay, it's out. And they went everywhere, all over town, looking for this recording, and nobody had heard of it. And finally, somebody said, oh, it may be that little disc that goes into a toy. And she brought out this tiny Santa that had a slit in its stomach, and you pushed and there's Michael singing.
Do you remember what songs he was singing on the track?
Silent Night, the normal. Yeah.
The traditional Christmas songs. Yeah. And you mentioned Hong Kong. And I think that's something that was really revelatory for me in reading the book was discovering how much you and your family had traveled at such a young age. I mean, Michael had traveled in many ways all over the world long before he had started touring.
Yeah. My dad was my stepdad, but he was changing jobs a lot, and he loved to travel, and he just started taking these jobs that would move us around. I mean, I went to so many schools I can't even remember. But the boys, they spent most of their, the first 8 or 9 years. Michael went there, he was 5. So he was 12 or 13 when he left. So they did most of their schooling in Hong Kong. And then when he arrived back in Sydney, it was a shock for him because Hong Kong, it's the colonial place. It's the colony was very British, and things were very different in school, and the children were different. And he arrived back in Australia with this accent because when you live in Hong Kong, especially as a child, you get this, it's called an international accent. So it's a little bit American, a little bit British, because most of the people over there are either British or American. And so the kids made fun of him, and you know, until this one boy walked up to him and said he would, he said, just hang around with me because, they're really bad, especially if you have an accent, you're different, you're wearing a different uniform. And I've got this friend and he's really tall and the kids are afraid of him. So, and that was Andrew Farris that walked up to him. And he did have this friend.
Andrew Farris becomes his first friend when you went to Australia. Oh,
yes.
What a friendship that would become.
Yeah. Who would know, huh? So, they were fast friends.
And you mentioned Farris, and of course, the Farris brothers are critical. They are the founding members of INXS. Michael was still in high school when he connected with them, of course, not knowing at the time that they would form INXS. But looking back at that time, Tina, and knowing who Michael was, is there any surprise in seeing the success that your brother and the band would later achieve?
Well, the surprise was that Michael would get out in front of people. I mean, he was a very sort of fun-loving kid and a very easygoing kid. He was pretty wonderful that way. But to actually get out in front of people, I once put him in, while we were in Hong Kong, he was about 8 years old. I put him in a children's fashion show that I had put together. And he stood back. I said, "It's time. It's your time to walk." And he really. And I pushed him. I pushed him onto the stage, and he started walking. And then pretty soon, he was right into it. I mean, he turned around. He smiled at the people, but to actually get up on a stage, it never occurred to me he'd sing. I hadn't heard him sing, so. That was quite a shock. It really wasn't a surprise to me because he'd now found something that he loved. And up till then, all I saw him doing was writing poetry. And the teachers would keep telling him, I mean, you're not going to make a living writing poetry.
Little did they know.
They were wrong. But yes. But singing, I had I mean, he didn't sing around the house or anything, but he would call me every now and then and tell me what they were doing. Next thing, he was right as he was finishing school. They'd all finished high school except Johnny, the young Farris, the drummer. And their parents decided to go back to live in Perth, which is way the other side of Australia to Sydney. So they were so determined because Johnny was showing signs of being a terrific drummer then. I mean, the Farris boys were brought up as musicians. They always were musicians. So they decided they'd, wait till the last day of school, and they took off. And Johnny finished off the rest of his year while they were in Perth, and the rest of the band just stayed there. They started writing then. That's when Michael really started writing. And they also did some gigs. They'd grab Johnny from school on Friday afternoon and travel way up the east side of into terrible areas. I mean, it's where all the mining is getting done. So these mining towns, it's just all men. And they just come off. All they want to do is do some hard rocking and a lot of drinking in a bar every Friday night and Saturday night, and then they have to go back out again. So it was pretty rough mob. And Michael, with this accent, slightly different, did not speak with an Australian accent. To them, he seemed effeminate. So being in a place like this, where he was very proper, did everything on stage, jumped around just the way we saw him later on. But they were very suspicious of him, the people who frequented these bars, But he figured, well, if he could get through that, he could get through anything, you know. It was pretty rough, not easy, but after approximately 9 months, John finished school and they came right back to Sydney and just started their onslaught right away. Just started making up flyers and putting them around, speaking to people, you know.
They were very focused.
Very focused. They just knew because they'd already been writing. Michael realized he did have a voice. He didn't know it was as good as it really was. He had no idea. And they were all great musicians. They were really, this was it. There was nothing else for them. And when it came to getting out there, they just decided they just would get in this great big minivan and with all their instruments, one roadie who drove, and they just, I mean, from Melbourne to Sydney, we don't have, especially back then, we didn't have freeways. So it would take 12 hours. They'd go all the way down there and do a gig and come back. I mean, they were happy to do that just to be on stage.
Yeah. Michael Hutchence and INXS were household names by 1992, racking up awards all over the world, following hits like Need You Tonight, Never Tear Us Apart, New Sensation. The Me, Myself, and TBI studios were rocking to New Sensation earlier this afternoon. But that year would also mark what you considered the beginning of the end. What happened in 92?
Around April or May of 92, he was in Denmark with Helena Christensen, his girlfriend. They were staying at her apartment. She said, let's go get some takeout. So they had just picked some takeout up, and he was standing on he wasn't quite on the footpath. You know, he was standing there. He was just going up to the footpath, and this cab came around the corner. And, you know, the streets over there are very tiny. And he couldn't get past Michael. And Michael seemed to be taking too long because there were people there. He was trying to get onto the footpath. And the cab driver came to a screeching halt, got out of his cab, went straight up to Michael without no yelling or anything. He just went up and punched him like I think they call it a soccer punch.
A sucker punch.
Sucker punch. And Michael was just, he's staying there with food in his hands. Michael went straight back, hit the back of his head, fractured his head, and it did damage to the olfactory, which is up on the front left side, which right away he lost his senses of taste and smell. He was taken to the emergency, and he was having trouble because, he wasn't speaking the language. Helena was trying to help him, and they did x-rays and so forth, but, the things that they do, something like that doesn't show up in an MRI or anything. So he insisted he wasn't going to stay the night. They actually wanted to keep him there, and he said, no, he's not. He right away was just angry. And so he went back to Helena's apartment, and there he stayed for 3 weeks. She tells me that he didn't, he kept saying no, he didn't want to eat because he couldn't taste it. He was very angry. He didn't, he just wasn't himself, and he just stayed in the bedroom all the time. And he didn't really know what kind of damage he had done until he went to London sometime later and actually spoke to a doctor in London.
You do talk about that in your book. About a month or so following the incident, Michael ended up seeing a specialist. Do you know what the doctor told him?
I don't know exactly what the doctor told him because he was very quiet about that kind. He didn't want to talk about it. I would call him and he would be very short on the phone, which was not like Michael at all. But he just wanted to dismiss it. So we didn't know a lot about it. But apparently, he did tell him he'd sustained a pretty bad injury, and Michael obviously was asking him what he should do, and all he did was put him on downers because that's what they were doing then. They didn't know a lot about head injuries. And if you were walking around, you seemed okay. So maybe you're a little upset, but, so take a Prozac. When I called him, because I was worried about him, I mean, we kept in contact very closely. He would call my mother probably once a week. She would call him if he didn't. And he usually was so excited to speak to any of us. And he would be until you asked about the accident or what happened.
How did you find out about the accident?
It wasn't until a couple of weeks later he told my mother, and she asked me to call him because she knew that he didn't always tell her everything. But he didn't want to talk about it to me. He's, it's fine, it's nothing, a bump on the head, And
is that what you thought?
That's what I thought at the time. It wasn't until we got into maybe 6 months later, and he just wasn't himself. And when I say he wasn't himself, what I mean is Michael was a very easygoing guy, very easygoing. If you change plans on him, oh, well, okay. He stayed close to his family, as I say, and he was in and out of LA where I was living all the time, and he'd call and we'd go to dinner and he'd take my children to whatever, and he'd come over. He always asked for a baked dinner, an Australian baked dinner. But we noticed that sometimes we'd hear that he was in town and he didn't call.
And that was odd to you?
Very odd. I mean, yeah.
Why was that odd?
I mean, he never came into LA without calling me. I just knew that. So this seemed, it's like, what happened? Why isn't he's sort of pulling away from the family or something? I mean, there was one instance that the band was in town, and I called him, and he said, "Oh, sure, the tickets will be at the will call and blah blah." And I was taking my daughter and like 5 of her little girlfriends, and I called him and said, "Will you be available before the show?" And he said, "No." I just, I was sort of pang of disappointment, and I didn't know what was going on. But we went to the show, and afterward, he came out, and I said, "How about some time with your niece?" And he spent a little time, and then he left. So the very next day, I called him at the hotel. I first sent a letter down by courier and called him, and then he called me back and said, "I want you to come down to the hotel right now. We need to talk. You've got some crazy stuff in your head."
Because you had called him out?
Yes. I said, "I think you're getting a little full of yourself or something, which is so unlike you."
That's what you saw. The change in his behavior to you came off as arrogance.
Exactly. I mean, when did it come to where he didn't know us all of a sudden? That's very strange, And
How did he respond?
he said, "That's ridiculous. You come down to the hotel this afternoon, the two of us will talk." And I went down there and we spent about 3 hours thrashing it out. And I swear he would say he didn't know what I was talking about.
He didn't remember how he had behaved?
Yeah, he didn't remember and he didn't think he'd been rude. I said, "You didn't even acknowledge your family. What's wrong with you?"
That was completely out of the ordinary for him.
Oh, that would never happen. Never. And I noticed actually that night before that the whole band wasn't around talking together. He was very much separate from the band too.
And that was unusual.
Unusual. Yeah. So we sat there and talked and he still, he said, "No, I'm just busy, and I didn't think I was dissing you or anything." And it there's a lot of pressure and it's mostly on me. I have to do all the interviews. Nobody wants to interview the other guys. I'm always in there. So while they're off playing golf, I'm doing interviews and then I'm on the stage that night. It's just too much. I said, "Take time off."
But these were things that he was already doing prior to the injury, though.
He was. Absolutely.
And it hadn't weighed on him before like this.
Right. He'd never said anything before. It was fine. He'd make jokes about it. And the guys are playing golf and I'm sitting in a hotel room, they're sending one interviewer in after another. And so I feel like I should be getting more, but he'd joke about it,
Right, Sure.
And so, well, I assured him that, there was something very strange and that he just wasn't being his happy self. He just absolutely would not buy it. And he changed the subject. He said, "Hey, it's your birthday tomorrow." I said, "Oh, yeah, I didn't even think you'd remember." And he said, "Yeah, I got something great for you." He said, "Oh, you'll love this jacket." And it was I can't even remember. It was a designer jacket. I still have it. I love that jacket. But I wasn't convinced and I wasn't happy about that afternoon. He was being so, normally he was have this smile. He still would do the smile and a big hug. He used to just hold on to me. But he then got very serious and very defensive. He was defensive for most of the time. And there's just something wrong,
Did you make the connection, though? Were you ever thinking that this change that I'm seeing in Michael could potentially be linked to this accident that resulted in a brain injury?
I didn't really. No, I'd never heard about anything like that. And he seemed fine. He said he was fine and he was working and he didn't have any trouble with, his poetry and songwriting. And so no, I didn't. And even when he died, I didn't.
It's been reported, Tina, that his girlfriend at the time of the attack, former supermodel Helena Christensen, swore to secrecy about the injury that left him with permanent brain damage. Why do you think it was important to him that no one know?
I think he was afraid that people would think he'd lost what he had. He didn't quite know what he had. And that, when I say that, I mean that person that we saw on stage, it was the person we would see, that was him, that he had this, he did have charisma. It was just something in him that made people want to speak to him. He didn't have to be Michael Hutchence vocalist on the stage to have people come to him. He just had that certain magnetism. But I think he didn't understand it. And maybe he thought he'd lost it. Since his mind was full of lots of things, with this injury. I was in in his villa in the south of France. We'd go there for Christmas, the whole family. We had the best Christmases there. He loved it. He loved to entertain. He loved to cook. And even when he told me he'd lost his senses of taste and smell, when he was cooking, he'd still put something under his nose, either wine or, taste. It was like automatic. But I would see a sadness there. If you really watched him, you'd see a sadness, because that never came back.
I'm wondering, Tina, how would you make sense or explain to yourself what you saw in this new Michael, this Michael who had made such a departure from the easygoing, kind of laid back, fun guy? How did you reconcile these changes?
I guess he kept telling me that he was under a lot of pressure. I think he was living a very fast life. Relationships in the band weren't very good at that time. Partly, Michael was getting tired of doing the same, what he said was, the same old songs, the same style. I mean, you think about, we love these songs, but when you're up there singing every night the same set, it must get hard. He felt that he couldn't get the band to move into the 90s, and he'd had a lot of offers to record with other people. Not that it would make him leave the band. He still loved INXS. But what it did was, he couldn't take those offers. He wanted to try, different singing styles. He knew he could, and he could do it. And he wanted to try writing with someone else, just to branch out and see what the possibilities.
So there was a lot of frustration?
A lot of frustration on that level. He was getting very tired of the supermodel thing, just the lifestyle, just following Helena around when he wasn't, because INXS wasn't touring as much at that time. So that left him with a lot of open time that he wanted to just spend at home, and write and so forth. But Helena wanted him to come with her. So, and he did move to London. He didn't move to London, but he got a place in London. So he was spending more time there because Helena was doing a lot of stuff in London.
But then eventually that relationship broke apart, and he was then involved with Paula Yates.
Well, Paula Yates, his relationship in London started while he was with Helena.
Okay.
And that kicked off a whole lot of other problems,
So did you see the combination of the conflict with the band, relationship conflicts? Did you rationalize to yourself, well, okay, maybe the Michael that I'm seeing, this Michael who is sometimes short, sometimes not as easygoing as he used to be. Did you see those things as the reason why he had changed so drastically in his behavior? Is that how you explained it to yourself?
At first, I thought he'd changed because INXS had gotten so big. And in particular, Michael was the face of INXS. There was a bit of jealousy in the band for that reason. But I think most people want to interview the lead singer, but they didn't see it that way. It was supposed to be, one for all. And so, and then he did get involved. He had a lot of spare time on his hands. I believe he was getting into some different types of drugs that he and Rhett always kept that kind of thing away from me, but it wasn't, I was not stupid, I know. Yes, he was trying other things, and he was spending time in London, and he met up with Paula Yates.
Paula Yates was married to Bob Geldof, who was widely known for his connection to Live Aid. She'd been married to him, had children with him. They were in the middle of a divorce, a very contentious custodial battle. And that relationship impacted her relationship with your brother and the child that she had with Michael.
That's absolutely fair to say. That was probably the worst person he could have been with at that time, with the brain injury. I mean, so it was such a contentious relationship.
Michael had been a front man and the star of INXS for many years. They had toured around the world multiple times on different albums. I certainly remember the Kick album and all the hits that one generated. But in your book, you talk about how the combination of where he was at with the band in terms of looking outside of the band for growth and new opportunities, and also where he was at with the relationship with his child's mother, Paula Yates. The combination of all of these things, you say in your book, he could handle if not for brain injury. With a brain injury, though,
Yes.
It was the worst possible combination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, he could not hear the band. I mean, I was at a couple of shows, and he sort of slid over some words a couple of times.
What do you mean slid over?
Well, he would be singing a song, and he'd go into, between the chorus, he'd go off onto a different line. He was forgetting the lyrics. And I asked him about this. I went back. I didn't want to make him crazy. I mean, at that stage, I was starting to sort of tiptoe a little bit around him. The way he explained it was that he goes off somewhere else in his head sometimes because he's sick of being on stage and singing the same songs.
But did you think that was the real reason, or did you think there was something more to it?
No, I felt that he really was forgetting, but he wouldn't own to that.
He wouldn't admit it.
No. And nobody in the band said anything.
Well, they didn't know about the brain injury.
Yeah.
They may have seen, it's possible that they would have seen his behavior as, he's the lead guy. He can kind of do whatever he wants. No one's making the connection that it could possibly be linked to this brain injury because no one knows about it. No,
absolutely. That's right. He was keeping it quiet. They knew he'd hit his head, but he didn't, there was nothing else. They thought he was being full of himself.
Did he ever talk about Tina getting the sense of smell back? Was that permanent, the loss of smell and taste?
I was on the phone with him right after Tiger was born. And he said, I'm cradling her right now, but you know what? I can't even smell that wonderful baby smell.
That must have been heartbreaking.
It was heartbreaking to hear, and it was heartbreaking to... it was horrible. I mean, I just know being on the phone, it was like we were crying together. That meant so much to him.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book, Tina, about coming across an article that someone wrote about their own history of traumatic brain injury and realizing their experience reflected what you had seen in Michael. How so?
Yeah, Amy Zellmer wrote that. She's wonderful, writing. She's written a couple of books on TBI from her own experience. When I read that, I read it over a couple of times, and something just like a light bulb went off.
What stood out to you?
The way she would say that, how she would forget things. That stood out to me, and I just thought about Michael, forgetting his lyrics to his own songs. And then she talked about how, most doctors don't even acknowledge this, that there are plenty of football players and so forth, and they're only starting now to see and to see this is a real thing.
So this article starts you putting pieces together?
Yes.
What were the pieces you started putting together?
Well, the fact that Michael's his personality had changed. She had talked about that. And so I thought, yes, he's had changed too. He just sort of, you weren't sure who you were going to see today. The fact that she lost some friends because they wouldn't believe it was a real thing. They kept thinking that, they kept saying she's, get over it. That accident was a year ago, 2 years ago. And she said, that's not how traumatic brain injuries work. They're with you now. Some people, their whole personality changes completely the rest of their life. They are not the same person. And I thought about that and thought about the fact that, the band was treating him differently because they couldn't understand him, and how I had actually treated him differently. I'd been angry with him, and I thought that's obviously the reason, because how could somebody as sweet as Michael change that much? And he didn't do anything about that injury. He never went to anybody after speaking to Helena, after speaking to other people around him, his management. He never went to anybody to talk about this, what was happening to him, just that everything was driving him crazy, that, he can't make people happy, and he hadn't changed. What's wrong with everybody?
Richard Lowenstein, a collaborator of INXS, he had directed some of their videos and later a documentary about Michael. Explain his role in helping you understand what happened to your brother. He had the autopsy investigated.
He did, where with me, I threw it away because I didn't want to read it. He took it to somebody who is an expert on this and understands what they're talking about that's going on in the brain. And she said, look, we have found, it was different back then in the 90s, but we have found that people with this kind of injury, sooner or later, when I'm reading this person was going to take his life anyway. That it would be very unusual, that he would have to have a lot of people around him. He'd have to have a lot of support not to take his life. And he didn't have that. He was just treating it as, got this, this bump on the head, and I'm crazy. The band is nuts, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to do different music, and they won't let me.
It's, it seems to me that a lot of loud noise, bright lights, touring, lack of rest, all of these things make for a disaster, particularly for someone who is post-brain injury.
Oh, absolutely. Brain injury, those are the things, loud noises, weird lighting, just being on tour with a lot of people around you, people shouting at you, wanting you all the time. Those are the things, the main things that can make you crazy when you should avoid at all cost. He was doing exactly what he shouldn't have been doing. And he didn't want to finish the tour. And he said he would see me in Australia.
Do you recall, Tina, how you found out about his suicide?
Yes. Michael was in Los Angeles. He left on the Sunday night. He got to Australia on the Tuesday. I'd been seeing him in Los Angeles. When he called before he was leaving, before he called off, he said, I really don't want to go. I just don't want to get that flight. I said, don't. Other people call off shows. He had 6 more shows in Australia. Other people take time out. You know, a band, somebody gets ill, somebody's wife gets ill. You can put these off until mid-year or something. Take some time. You need it. No, I can't let anybody down, he said.
Looking back, knowing what you know now, what is it you think you may have done differently? Do you think you would have been perhaps more aggressive about pushing him into being seen by a medical team and getting treatment for this?
Well, I didn't have all the information with me at the time, so I don't get upset with myself. I sometimes think that I shouldn't have been so easygoing with him on those last conversations. So I just told him I look forward to seeing him in 3 weeks. And he left. And so
that opportunity never came.
That never came because that was Sunday night for me. And then the following Friday night, I came home to a message on my machine from Rit, and it was, call me, don't put television on, don't talk to anybody, call me as soon as you get in. Just don't talk to anybody. Just please call me. I'm at Mom's.
Right. What would you say to the sister, the mother, or the brother of a loved one who is seeing a dramatic change in behavior? Mm-hmm. And somewhere in that loved one's history, they know that they suffered some sort of head injury.
Right. I would say to somebody who can see changes in their loved one, and they know they've had an injury to the head, they insist they'll take them to the doctors. They'll go with them. Let's look into this a little more, because you may not notice changes in yourself, but we see changes. Do this for me. Just, placate me. I would have done that had I known. Mostly the problem with all of us in the family is we were in different countries. We would catch, and sometimes when I'd want to talk to Michael about anything, he'd say, no, let's just have a good dinner. And, I'm only here for 3 days. And, so that is that's a very different situation to what most people have. Right. But, if you're in a position where you can speak to your loved one, go with them. Just insist. And if that doctor says, no, I don't see anything, but you have a feeling, you can see changes, go to another doctor.
Thank you so much, Tina. Tina Hutchence, her book is Michael, My Brother, Lost Boy of INXS. Thank you for joining me today, Tina.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you, Christina.
To order a copy of the book, please visit the Me, Myself, and TBI website.